sometimes I wish I'd never met you. I wish they never did in that school what they did to you. You're still hurting, Charlie. We're going to hurt
And
for
a corrupt
long
cop
time.
in Training
We
Day.
heard from the before.
Samuel
Makes us
L.
hurt
Jackson
so bad
played a cop
right
in
now.
Freedom Land, a gangster in Pulp Fiction, a cop turned private detective in SWAT, a villain in a wheelchair in Unbreakable, and a fight promoter in Hype. And these were all principal or leading roles. And at the same time, native actors, Eddie Little Sky, Sheila Tousey, Nathan Lee Chasing His Horse, Irene Bedard, Tantu Cardinal, Evan Adams, Byron Chief Moon, Ben Cardinal, Tina Louise Bomberry, Shirley Chichu, Rodney Grant, Michael Horse, Billy Morasti, Elaine Miles, Floyd Red Crow Westerman, Ted Thinelk, John Trudell, Eric Schweg, Tom Jackson, Alex Rice, Russell Means were cast, and for the most part continue to be cast with stunning regularity as Indians, in mostly minor roles. So is there a dearth of talent in Indian country? Well, Chief Dan George, Salish, was nominated for an Academy Award for his role as Old Lodgeskins in the 1970 film Little Big Man, while Graham Greene was nominated for the same award for his role as Kicking Bird in the 1991 film Dances with Wolves. Of course, both of these roles were 19th century Indians, and there is a troubling assumption that an Indian playing an Indian is an infinitely easier acting job than, say, an Italian actor playing a mobster or an Irish actor playing a cop. I spent a fair amount of time trying to find Indian actors, apart from Will Rogers, who have been given in the continue to be cast Tina Louise Bomberry, Shirley Chichu, Rodney Grant, Michael Horse, Billy Morasti, Elaine Miles, Floyd Red Crow Westerman, Ted Thinelk, award for his mobster, or an Irish actor playing a cop. Lewis is none. God, I love. Chapter 4. One name to rule them all. Growing up in rural Alberta, in a town with fewer Indians than ideas about Indians. Marilyn Dumont, a really good brown girl. If North America doesn't like live Indians, and it doesn't like legal Indians, why doesn't the military, political, corporate complex just kill us off? I know this question sounds melodramatic and absurd, but I've been to rallies, marches, and protests where some clever wit has shouted out from the crowd, "We should have killed all of you, expletive deleted, Indians, when we had the chance." I'd like to believe that this kind of remark is just the huffing and puffing of bigoted buffoonery, but I've heard it too many times. Such sentiments may not be the rule, but neither are they the exception. Why didn't we kill you off when we had the chance? It's a fair question. Why didn't the United States keep dropping atomic bombs on Japan? If 2 bombs were good, wouldn't 4 have been better? Why didn't Turkey keep on killing Armenians after World War I? What stopped the murderous purges of China's Mao Zedong, Russia's Joseph Stalin, Cambodia's Pol Pot, and North Korea's Kim Il-sung? A friend of mine suggested that I include George W. Bush for his efforts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and much of the rest of the world. But if I did that, I'd have to throw in AT&T, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. And once you start down that road, there's no end to the list of killers and killings. Even without the testimony of scholars and social scientists, we know that we don't mind killing as much as we think we should. In particular, contemporary history has demonstrated that we don't mind killing people we don't like, and we don't mind killing if it can be done at a distance and out of sight. And killing is especially acceptable if the slaughter can be attributed to a defect in the victims, or to a flaw in their way of life, or to an immutable law of nature, or all of the above. How fortunate it is to have so many excellent ways of destroying a people without getting one's hand stamped. Why didn't we kill you off when we had the chance? Maybe the answer isn't all that complicated. Maybe killing is like most everything else. Do it enough times and it loses its appeal. Maybe it gets boring. A pervasive myth in North America supposes that native people and native culture are trapped in a state of stasis. Those who subscribe to it imagine that, like Vladimir and Estragon in Samuel Beckett's play Waiting for Godot, natives were unable to move forward along the linear continuum of civilization, that we were waiting for someone to come along and lead us in the right direction, to free us from ourselves. In Beckett's play, as everyone knows, Godot never arrives. In the native version, Europeans never leave. In some ways, I envy Vladimir and Estragon. Who knows what unfortunate turns their lives might have taken had Godot managed to land on their shores. This idea that native people were waiting for Europeans to lead us to civilization is just a variation on the old savagism versus civilization dichotomy. But it is a dichotomy that North America trusts without question. It is so powerful a toxin that it contaminates all of our major institutions. Under its influence, democracy becomes not simply a form of representative government, but an organizing principle that bundles individual freedoms, Christianity, and capitalism into a marketable product carrying with it the unexamined promise of wealth and prosperity. It suggests that anything else is, by default, savage and bankrupt. Of course, we know that this is untrue. The ancient Romans, Chinese, Egyptians, the Mayas, and the Incas didn't practice democracy, or Christianity for that matter, and they managed to create civilizations that were vigorous, civilizations that we admire. North America defends democracy as the cornerstone of social, religious, and political enlightenment because it is obligated to think well of itself and its institutions. So, in North America, according to Western Orthodoxy, you had Europeans who were enlightened and Indians who were not. For the first century or so, the two groups killed each other. Not all the time, of course. In between depredations and deprivations, Europeans and Indians found time for commerce. The French traded with the Algonquin tribes, such as the Huron, while the English traded with the Iroquoian tribes, such as the Mohawk. And for the next 200 years or so, the two groups traded and fought and traded. When the dust cleared from the so-called 7 Years' War, the American Revolutionary War, and the War of 1812, what had been, according to William Bradford, a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men, was now two nation-states, Canada and the United States, all clean and spanking new. That's not quite true. While the United States became its own nation in 1776, Canada had to wait another 91 years for nationhood to become official. Of course, that didn't stop Great Britain, the United States, and the geographical lump that would later become Canada from drawing an imaginary political line from the Atlantic along the St. Lawrence, ziggy-zag through the Great Lakes, across the prairies, over the Rockies, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and agreeing that all the land north of the 49th parallel, more or less, would be the property of England come Canada, and all the land south of the 49th parallel, more or less, would belong to the United States. Trees, lakes, rivers, mountains, swamps, deserts, bays, islands, animals, plants, birds, minerals. Indians. Indian-white relations were originally constructed around the concerns of commerce, the fur trade being a prime example, and military alliances. In these matters, native people understood themselves to be sovereign, independent nations, and in early land and treaty negotiations they were treated as such. But by the late 1700s, as European military forces gained the upper hand, whites began to reimagine the place of Indian nations in North America. In the U.S. Articles of Confederation, the federal government gave itself the exclusive right to regulate the trade and managing all affairs with the Indians. This power was repeated in the 1790 Trade and Intercourse Act, which further refined trade and affairs to include the purchase and sale of Indian land. The intent of these two pieces of legislation was clear. Whatever powers states were to have, those powers did not extend to native peoples. Beginning in 1823, there would be 3 U.S. Supreme Court decisions: Johnson versus McIntosh, Cherokee versus Georgia, Worcester versus Georgia. That would confirm the powers that the U.S. government had unilaterally taken upon itself and spell out the legal arrangement that tribes were to be allowed. I'm always looking for the funny bit in the historical record, the ironic slant, the chuckle. Something to make a dull subject interesting, something to make a boring discussion lively. But there really isn't much of anything that could be described as delightful in these 3 decisions, so we might as well get to it. 1823, Johnson versus McIntosh. The court decided that private citizens could not purchase land directly from Indians, since all land in the boundaries of America belonged to the federal government by right of discovery. Native people could sell their land only to the U.S. government. Indians had the right of occupancy, but they did not hold legal title to their lands. 1831, Cherokee versus Georgia. The state of Georgia attempted to extend state laws to the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee argued that they were a foreign nation and therefore not subject to the laws of Georgia. The court held that Indian tribes were not sovereign, independent nations, but domestic, dependent nations. 1832, Worcester versus Georgia. This case was a follow-up to Cherokee versus Georgia. Having determined that the Cherokee were a domestic dependent nation, the court settled a matter of jurisdiction, ruling that the responsibility to regulate relations with native nations was the exclusive prerogative of Congress and the federal government. These 3 cases unilaterally redefined relationships between whites and Indians in America. Native nations were no longer sovereign nations. Indians were reduced to the status of children and declared wards of the state. And with these decisions, all Indian land within America now belonged to the federal government. While these rulings had legal standing only in the United States, Canada would formalize an identical relationship with Native people a little later in 1876 with the passage of the Indian Act. Now it was official. Indians in all of North America were property. When she read the passage above, Helen was concerned that the word property might imply that I was suggesting that Indians were slaves. That's not accurate. We were more like furniture. The 3 U.S. court cases, along with Canada's Indian Act, were not random, standalone decisions. They were part of a coordinated undertaking to organize Indians. Even though disease and conflict had dramatically reduced the tribes, there were still, in the minds of policymakers, too many Indians. Too many Indians, too many tribes, too many languages. Indians were a great sprawling mess. What was needed was a plan to give this snarl of cultures a definitive and manageable form. So, out of ignorance, disregard, frustration, and expediency, North America set about creating a single entity, an entity that would stand for the whole. The Indian. Or, as J.R.R. Tolkien might have said, one name to rule them all, one name to find them, one name to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. No one really believed that there was only one Indian. No one ever said there was only one Indian. But as North America began to experiment with its Indian programs, it did so with a one-size-fits-all mindset. Rather than see tribes as an arrangement of separate nation-states in the style of the Old World, North America imagined that Indians were basically the same. Sure, Mohawk were not Apache, Cherokee were not Cheyenne, but the differences among Native people were really just a matter of degree. All for one, one for all. Now the only real question was what to do with this Indian. What could North America expect of this Indian? What might be this Indian's place, if any, in the new order? With the proper guidance, what might this Indian become? These questions and their answers would form the backbone of what we call Indian policy. Prior to the 1800s, military action had been, by default, Indian policy in North America. But in the 19th century, gunboat diplomacy was augmented by treaties, removals, and relocations, all bundled into a package that we will call Plan A. Plan A wasn't so much a coherent undertaking as it was a series of speculations about how to shuffle Indians out of the way of white settlement and economic development. Plan A was also a pattern. Someone would start a conflict, it didn't matter who, and the military would come to the rescue. A treaty would be negotiated in which Native people, if they were fortunate, were forced to give up a portion of their land but allowed to keep the remainder and stay where they were. If they were unfortunate, tribes and bands were forced to give up all of their land and move elsewhere to a location chosen for them. During the colonial period, European powers signed over 1,500 such treaties with Native people, while, on their own, the United States and Canada signed well over 500. In the United States, the first treaty was signed with the Delaware in 1778, and the last one with the Nez Perces in 1868. Treaty-making in the United States was eliminated by statute in 1871, which, coincidentally, was the same year that Canada began signing treaties, starting with the 11 numbered treaties that dealt with First Nation bands in Alberta, British Columbia, Manitoba, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and the Northwest Territories. The last of the so-called historical treaties was signed in 1923 with the Chippewa and Mississauga First Nations, while the last modern treaty was signed in 2000 with the Nisga'a. Though given the number of outstanding native land claims, there may well be more treaties on Canada's horizon. Peace treaties should have been the answer to Indian-white conflict. But, as Vine Deloria Jr. points out, America has yet to keep one Indian treaty or agreement. Sweeping generalizations are always suspect. But I'm not sure that Deloria is wrong. I have no idea what Deloria thought of Canada's record of keeping its promises to Native people, but I doubt he would have been impressed. More than one scholar has argued that treaties were never meant to be long-standing agreements, that they were simply expediencies of the moment. Indians were dying, so the wisdom of the day argued, in 50 or 100 years, Native people would be gone, and the gnarly logistical questions that the terms of the treaties might raise in the long term would be resolved naturally through attrition. In the meantime, however, the combination of military action, treaties, and the myth of native extinction was not working fast enough to keep pace with the demand for space. Even though they had ceased to be a military threat, even though they had been forced to give up vast tracts of land, Indians were, through no fault of their own, still in the way, still inconvenient. The official rationale for removal and relocation was Indian welfare. Removing Indians from the path of white settlement would reduce the potential for conflicts. Separating Indians from whites would limit the occasions for racism. Removal and relocation would limit the availability of white vices such as alcohol. Out of sight of whites and away from the corrupting influences of white culture, Indians would be able to maintain their own cultures in peace. Oh, and by the way, Indians had more land than they needed, more land than they knew what to do with, more land than they deserved. The assault on Aboriginal land was greater in the United States, where the flow of settlement had assumed the proportions of a tidal wave. In 1763, the British tried to control this tsunami with a proclamation that forbade white settlement west of the Appalachians. This line was not intended to be a permanent boundary. Rather, it was a stratagem to maintain the peace with the tribes between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, while at the same time allowing for the slow and orderly settlement of the Trans-Appalachian West. But by 1763, it was already too late for such lines and such cautions. The boundary had already been breached, with more settlers pouring in all the time. Since no politician wanted to alienate Western voters by trying to evict them, it was decided that the best course of action would be to move Indians to another place. Just not here. In the United States, sentiment for forcing Indians out of areas that whites wanted was as old as the first colonies. But it got its legislative legs in the early 1800s with Thomas Jefferson. In 1802, Georgia was asked to cede the western portion of its lands to the federal government. Georgia agreed to the deal, but only with the stipulation that the federal government secure and turn over title to all lands held by Indian tribes within Georgia's new boundaries to the state. In 1803, Jefferson drafted a constitutional amendment that authorized Congress to trade land west of the Mississippi, bought from France in the Louisiana Purchase, for land that the tribes held in the east. The amendment was never submitted for ratification, but in 1804, Congress passed legislation that authorized the president to pursue such a policy, and the sooner the better. Tribes were not particularly keen on moving anywhere, but there was no mistaking the intent of whites and their government. In 1804, Henry Harrison, the governor of Indiana, negotiated a treaty with a small contingent of Sauk chiefs who had come to discuss the fate of a Sauk warrior accused of killing 3 settlers. Harrison offered to release the man if the Sauk would compensate the families of the slain settlers, which wasn't a problem since this was Sauk custom anyway. But Harrison wanted more. He also insisted that the Sauk sign a removal treaty that ceded all of the tribe's land in Illinois and Wisconsin. Various stories have Harrison intimidating the men, or getting them drunk until they had their names on his treaty. The fact that the Sauks who signed the treaty had no authority to do so didn't bother Harrison or the politicians in Washington in the least. In fact, scenarios such as this were commonplace, coercion coming in a variety of forms and flavors. If a tribe or a band refused to sign a removal treaty, government officials would find a few members who could be convinced to sign, and then the treaty would be applied to the entire tribe. Native people opposed to such treaties and tactics were frequently threatened with military action. Annuity payments from a previous treaty would be withheld to force compliance. A food source such as the buffalo would be driven off or destroyed in order to bring Indians to heel. These were some of the methods used to bully the Choctaw into the Treaty of Doak's Stand in 1820, and to force Big Bear's Cree to sign Treaty 6 in 1876. Removal as national policy began in the United States when the Removal Act was signed into law by Andrew Jackson in 1830. That same year, in his second annual address to Congress, Jackson justified the policy saying, "Toward the aborigines of the country, no one can indulge a more friendly feeling than myself, or would go further to reclaim them from their wandering habits and make them a happy, prosperous people." And then he asked the rhetorical question to which all of white North America knew the answer. What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute, occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion? Well, since you put it that way. The U.S. government may have been slow to react to Hurricane Katrina when it hit the Gulf Coast in 2005, or to British Petroleum's massive oil spill in 2010, but in 1830 they wasted no time implementing Indian removal legislation. Almost as soon as the bill had left the building, the Choctaw were hustled out of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and packed off to Indian Territory. That same year, in 1831, the Shawnee were dragged out of Ohio. The following year, the Ottawa and the Wyandot followed, leaving Ohio free of native people. In short order, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and portions of the Seminole were shipped west. By 1840, the majority of the tribes east of the Mississippi had been moved west of the river into what would eventually become Oklahoma. The Cherokee called the removal from Georgia Nana de Au Suni, or the trail where they cried. Out of some 17,000 Cherokee, over 4,000 died on the trail. Some historians claim the numbers were higher. Some claim they were lower. Whatever the actual number was, the Trail of Tears was, arguably, the largest massacre of native people in North American history. A Twin Towers moment. Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, Cherokee, Shawnee, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Sauk and Fox, Osage, Kickapoo, Wyandot, Ho-Chunks, Kaskaskia, Peoria, Miami, Delaware, Illinois, Modoc, Oto, Ponat, Seneca, Cayuga, Tuskegee, Quapaw. These are the names of a few of the tribes that were removed from their homelands during the middle of the 19th century. What you can't see by reading about these removals is that these were massive upheavals that, in many cases, broke the backs of the communities. No one has exact figures on how many native people were relocated during the years that removal was national policy. But for the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and the Seminole alone, the number was probably between 75,000 and 100,000. How many people were lost in these relocations? No one knows. At the time, no one really kept track. No one much cared. No one really cares now. Oh, sure, the tribes care, but they're biased. Canada didn't have an Indian removal policy, certainly not in the same way or on the same scale as their cousins to the south. However, the government did tinker with what it liked to call relocations, the moving of families, groups, and small bands from one place to another for a variety of reasons. In the States, removals were part of a national strategy to move native people off prime land and push them out of the way of white settlement. In Canada, relocations were employed ostensibly to further the official goals: protection, civilization, and assimilation of Canadian native policy. The 1996 report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples summed up relocation policy nicely. Government administrators saw Aboriginal people as unsophisticated, poor, outside modern society, and generally incapable of making the right choices. Confronted with the enormous task of adapting to modern society, they faced numerous problems that government believed could be solved only with government assistance. If they appeared to be starving, they could be moved to where game was more plentiful. If they were sick, they could be placed in new communities where health services and amenities such as sewers, water, and electricity were available. If they were thought to be indolent, the new communities would provide education and training facilities, which would lead to integration into the wage economy. If they were in the way of expanding agricultural frontiers or happened to occupy land needed for urban settlement, they could be moved for their own protection, and if their traditional lands contained natural resources, minerals to be exploited, forests to be cut, rivers to be dammed, they could be relocated in the national interest. The majority of relocations in Canada began in the 1940s, almost a century after the mass removals of Native people in the United States. You might have thought that by then the government would have learned something about such programs and policies. But perhaps the old adage is true after all. Those who do not understand the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. After watching what has happened over the past 50 years in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and seeing the money that is to be made from such ventures, I wonder if that adage should have a corollary. Those who understand the lessons of history are only too happy to repeat them. Still, 100 years is a long time. There was no particular reason for the Canadian government to remember what had happened to the Cherokee in the 1840s. After all, most governments can't remember the promises that got them elected. 100 years? In political terms, that's when dinosaurs ruled the planet. I said that the majority of relocations in Canada began in the 1940s, and that's true. But practice for what would later become unofficial policy began much earlier. In 1836, the Governor-General of Canada, Francis Bondhead, came up with the paternalistic notion that Indians needed to be protected from white vices. The most effective way to accomplish that, he decided, was to move them far away from white settlements. So, in 1836, at the same time that Georgia was getting ready to evict the Cherokee, Head forced the surrender of some 600,000 hectares of land south of Owen Sound, Ontario, that was held by the Nawash and the Saugeen bands of the Ojibwe. The Ojibwe were moved to what is now the Bruce Peninsula, with the promise that the area would be protected from white encroachment forever. 20 years later, the Nawash band was forced to give up its 4,000-hectare reserve once again to make way for more white expansion. This was followed by further surrenders in 1851, 1857, and 1861, as the Ojibwe in the area were pushed onto smaller and smaller parcels of land. Forever, it turned out, was a conditional rather than an absolute concept. Further to the west, the Songhees of Vancouver Island were being beguiled with the same adverb. In 1850, James Douglas, chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company, signed a treaty with the Songhees in which the band gave up a large parcel of land in exchange for a smaller parcel that was to be held in perpetuity for them and their descendants. Forever. Again. By 1859, the folks living in Victoria had become annoyed with Indians living next door and began suggesting that the Songhees be moved. Douglas, to his credit, objected. But after he retired in 1864, enthusiasm for relocation gathered strength and momentum. Finally, in 1911, the federal and provincial governments reached an agreement among themselves to move the Songhees to a reserve near Esquimalt. After all, the Songhees, according to the wisdom of the time, were only occupying the land. They didn't really own it. They hadn't improved it. They didn't appreciate its real value. Ergo, they didn't deserve it. Ergo. There's nothing like a little Latin to brighten a logical fallacy. In 1935, the Métis of St. Madeleine in Manitoba were confronted by the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Act, which allowed the government to turn farmland into pasture land in an attempt to control soil erosion in the prairies. Under the act, when pastures were created and people displaced, farmers were supposed to be compensated and relocated to other lands close to the lands that had been lost. But, technically, that applied only to farmers whose tax payments on the land were up to date. While the Métis had been living at St. Madeleine and working the land since around 1900, under the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Act, they did not have the same legal standing as their white neighbors. In spite of their tenure on the land, they were deemed squatters and evicted with little fanfare. Their houses were burned to the ground and their community was destroyed. No compensation. No land to replace the land that had been lost. The Métis of St. Madeleine weren't relocated. They were simply removed. But in 1942, about 2,000 Mi'kmaq living in some 20 scattered locations in Nova Scotia were relocated. The government decided to concentrate all the Mi'kmaq in the two largest settlements at Eskasoni and Shubenacadie. As the Mi'kmaq were mostly Catholic, the government enlisted the church's support in its relocation plan. The church was only too happy to help sell the idea of relocation, since concentrating the Mi'kmaq would make the church's work in religious instruction and assimilation considerably easier. The Mi'kmaq at Eskasoni and Shubenacadie weren't keen about the large influx of new residents, and the Mi'kmaq who were to be relocated weren't keen on moving. Both groups complained, sent letters of protest, and petitioned the government to reconsider, which was more or less like throwing mud at a wall. Of course, the Mi'kmaq were consulted. After all, Canada is, according to Canada, a just society. There were meetings. Government officials armed with maps and charts and pie graphs flew in to talk with Native people about a new future. The officials, sometimes with a respected member of the community at their side, sometimes with a local cleric in tow, coaxed, argued, cajoled, badgered, pleaded, and, on occasion, threatened. Sometimes relocation agreements were signed, and sometimes they weren't. The only constant in the process was that, long before the government ever raised the question of relocation with the people themselves, Ottawa had already decided what it wanted to do, had already decided what would be best for the Department of Indian Affairs, had already decided that what natives wanted or what natives thought wasn't terribly important and would have little or no bearing on the final outcome of the negotiations and consultations. Was relocation, or as the government called it, centralization, going to be good for the Mi'kmaq? That was never really the question. We do know that the government was looking for ways to cut costs, and the centralization of the Mi'kmaq made sense from an administrative point of view. As for the promises of houses, jobs, and a better future, relocation of the Mi'kmaq began in 1942. By 1944, only 10 new houses had been built at Eskasoni and Shubenacadie. By 1946, many of the families who had been moved to the two reserves were still living in tents. By 1948, unemployment at Eskasoni and Shubenacadie was rampant. even for the original residents, and the entire community was on welfare. By 1949, the government finally admitted that relocation hadn't been the money saver they'd hoped it would be, and shut the program down, leaving the Mi'kmaq worse off than they had been before the program began. Mind you, these lessons didn't seem to alter the general thinking in Ottawa, and in the 1950s and the 1960s, the Canadian government pressed ahead with its dubious ideas on relocation. In short order, the policies were inflicted on the Inuit at Hebron and Newtok in Labrador, the Saisei Dene in Manitoba, a number of the Yukon bands, Aishiak, Champagne, White River, Ross River, and Pelly River, the Guasala and the Nakwada of British Columbia, and the Mushani Innu of Davis Inlet, Labrador. You know what they say. If at first you don't succeed, try the same thing again. Sometimes this effort is called persistence and is the mark of a strong will. Sometimes it's called perseveration and is a sign of immaturity. For an individual, one of the definitions of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again in the same way and expecting different results. For a government, such behavior is called policy. Nothing to worry about, really. But if we ever get to the stars and find a new world that can support our version of life, and we decide to terraform the place, it would be best to keep the Department of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Affairs as far away from that planet as possible. The removals of the Saugeen and the Songhees and the Métis of St. Madeleine were early examples of pushing native peoples out of the way. But because most reserves were not in close proximity to white settlements, such removals, in Canada at least, were not the rule. It wasn't until after World War II, as the economy began to heat up, that Indians across North America found themselves being moved and relocated once again, this time to make way for large-scale industrial projects, in particular, hydroelectric projects. From British Columbia to Pennsylvania, from Saskatchewan to the Missouri River, from the Northwest Territories to Arizona, from Quebec to Washington, from Labrador to California, North America was building dams. Many of these dams were built on Indian land. The Army Corps of Engineers, in particular, was able to determine with amazing regularity that the best sites for dams just happened to be on Indian land, even when there were more suitable non-native sites available. Dams in the United States and Canada destroyed Aboriginal hunting and fishing resources, flooded villages and sacred sites, and forced the relocation of native people. One of the jokes that went around Indian country in the early 1960s, when the Kinzua Dam was being built in Pennsylvania, was that if Custer had brought along 2 or 3 Army Corps engineers, they would have built a dam across the Little Bighorn, drowned the Lakota and the Cheyenne, and made enough off the waterfront lots to pay for Custer's entire campaign. Helen tells me that I need to balance my generalizations with some examples. Luckily, I can do that. Initially authorized by the Flood Control Act of 1944, the Pick-Sloan Plan for Flood Control and Navigation of the Missouri River created a system of dams and reservoirs on the backs of over 24 tribes whose lands lay along the river in the Missouri River Basin. None of the tribes were consulted about the project. The Army Corps of Engineers simply ignored the various treaties that were in effect, acquired the land through eminent domain, and built the dams. While the Pick-Sloan Plan affected some 23 reserves, forced the relocation of over 1,000 families, and flooded about 155,000 acres of Indian farmland, The plan somehow avoided flooding any of the non-Indian towns along the Missouri. In 1967, construction began on the hydroelectric project at Churchill Falls in Newfoundland, in spite of the objections of the Innu, who lost over 1,900 square miles of traditional hunting and trapping lands to the subsequent flooding. The 1971 James Bay project on La Grande River in northwestern Quebec, in violation of earlier treaties with the Cree and Inuit, flooded over 11,500 square kilometers of Aboriginal land and forced the relocation of a number of native villages. Apologists for Quebec and Ottawa like to point out that in 1975, the Cree and the Inuit freely relinquished their claims to the land that was to be flooded when they signed the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, for which they received exclusive hunting and fishing rights to a large block of replacement land, along with $250 million in compensation. The agreement has been hailed as a model for white Aboriginal cooperation. Though it's difficult to see the cooperation, the Cree and the Inuit were not consulted about the project. Their strong objections to the project were not considered. Quebec and Ottawa didn't give a damn about what the Cree and the Inuit thought or wanted. And the agreement that was signed in 1975? Well, that wasn't a negotiation so much as it was the Cree and the Inuit making the best of a bad situation. Enough examples. You can look up Camano and the Cheslata, Grand Rapids and the Chimanwawin, Glen Canyon and the Navajo, Warm Springs and the Pomo, Shasta and the Winnemem Wintu, and the constricting of the Columbia River on your own, if you're so inclined. What needs to be said is that removals and relocations as federal policies in both countries allowed whites to steal Aboriginal land and push Native people about the countryside. Although it's accurate, I have to concede that if theft is legally sanctioned, it is no longer theft. So I should probably apologize for using the verb to steal. To appropriate might be more generous and less inflammatory. Moving Indians around the continent was like redecorating a very large house. The Cherokee can no longer stay in the living room. Put them in the second bedroom. The Mi'kmaq are taking up too much space in the kitchen. Move them to the laundry. The Seminoles can go from the master bedroom into the sunroom. And lean the Songhees against the wall in the upstairs hallway. We'll see if that works. For the time being, the Ojibwe, the Seneca, the Métis, and the Inuit can be stored in the shed behind the garage. And what the hell are we going to do with the Blackfoot, the Mohawk, and the Arapaho, and the Paiute? Do we have any garbage bags left? Of course, moving Indians around was not enough. Native people were always in the way, always underfoot. God knows North America spent a great deal of time and money. Allotment in 1887, termination and relocation in the 1950s, termination once again in the late 1960s, but this time in Canada, trying to find places to put them. But such efforts never seemed to suffice. Even after all the tribes had been moved out of that metaphorical house and into that metaphorical shed, Indians were still in the way. Worse, they were still Indians. While many native people spoke English, while many had converted to Christianity, and while many were small business entrepreneurs, native culture remained alive and well in North America. Removal and relocation had been effective in displacing and disrupting the lives of native people and taking their lands, but these policies and practices had not been the answer to the Indian problem. Still, North America was nothing if not resilient. Plan A hadn't worked. Time for Plan B. Chapter 5. We are sorry. Where do you begin telling someone their world is not the only one? Lee Miracle, Raven Song. Whenever someone says, Plan B, I'm instantly reminded of that wondrously horrid movie that Ed Wood wrote and directed back in 1956, Plan 9 from Outer Space. The film was shot in just 5 days and cost less than $20,000 to make. Much of the capital coming from a group of Baptist churches. How Wood got these folks to invest in a horror science fiction movie is a mystery. Although the best story has him convincing the clergy that if Plan 9 was successful, the profits could be used to make 12 movies about the lives of each of the apostles. In any case, the churches took their role as investors seriously, insisting that the original title, Grave Robbers from Space, be changed, that any dialogue they considered profane be removed, and that all members of the cast be baptized. The part about baptism is probably apocryphal, but had it been a deal-breaker, Wood would no doubt have obliged. In the film, aliens try to stop human beings from creating a doomsday weapon that will destroy the universe. In 1980, Michael Medved hailed Plan 9 as the worst film ever made. But when I look at the movie, with its cheap sets, its dreadful script, its pedestrian acting, its incompetent direction, and its rumors of mandatory conversion, it reminds me a great deal of North American Indian policy. Indeed, North America Indian policy in the last half of the 19th century had many of the qualities of a bad movie. It was a low-budget affair with a simplistic plot. Politicians, soldiers, clerics, social scientists, and people of unexamined goodwill dash about North America, saving themselves from Indians by saving Indians from themselves. But unlike Plan 9 from Outer Space, Plan B didn't include the option to get up and leave the theater. For 250 years, whites and Indians had fought as enemies, had fought as allies, had made peace, had broken the peace, and had fought each other again. But when Great Britain, France, and the newly formed United States sat down in 1783 to hammer out the details of the Treaty of Paris that would officially end the American Revolution, native people, who had fought alongside both England and the colonies, were neither invited to the negotiations nor mentioned in the treaty itself. So long, and thanks for all the fish. Indians were mentioned in the Treaty of Ghent, which tidied up the War of 1812. Article 9 specified that the United States cease all hostilities towards the nations of Indians and restore to the tribes all the possessions, rights, and privileges which they may have enjoyed or been entitled to in 1811, previous to such hostilities. The Americans more or less forgot about this particular article as soon as they signed the treaty. But anyone watching the film shouldn't have been surprised. Throughout the history of Indian-white relations in North America, there have always been two impulses afoot: extermination and assimilation. Extermination of native peoples, especially in the early years, was not considered genocide, a term coined in 1944 by the legal scholar Raphael Lemkin, so much as it was deemed a byproduct of manifest destiny, a term struck in the 1840s when U.S. Democrats used it to justify the war with Mexico. Extermination was also seen as an expression of natural law, a concept conceived by Aristotle in the 4th century and used by the Spanish humanist Juan de Sepulveda in the 16th as a legal justification for the enslavement of native people in the Caribbean and Mexico. The means of extermination didn't much matter. Bullets were okay, disease was fine, starvation was acceptable. In the minds of many, these were not so much cruelties as they were variations on the principles underlying the concept survival of the fittest, a phrase that Herbert Spencer had fashioned in 1864, and that would become synonymous with Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. The second impulse, assimilation, argued for salvation and improvement. One of the questions that the Spanish worried over was whether or not Indians were human beings. This was the subject of the great debate organized by the Vatican in Valladolid, Spain, in 1550 and 1551, where the cleric Bartolomé de la Casa maintained that Indians had souls and should be treated as other free men, while the aforementioned Juan de Sepulveda made the case on behalf of landowners, arguing that Indians did not have souls and were therefore natural slaves. De la Casa's position carried the day, but the Indians have souls argument provided no more than a philosophical victory and had no effect on the day-to-day actions of Spanish colonists in the New World, who continued to use Indians as slaves to run their plantations. Neither the English nor the French spent any time with this question. For these two groups, Indians were simply humans at an early point in the evolution of the species. They were savages with no understanding of orthodox theology, devoid of complex language, and lacking civilized manners. Barbarians, certainly, and quite possibly minions of the devil. But human beings nonetheless. And as such, many colonists believed that native people could be civilized and educated, believed that there was, within the Indian, the possibility for enlightenment. Extermination dominated the early contact period, assimilation the latter, until finally, in the 19th century, they came together in an amalgam of militarism and social theory that allowed North America to mount a series of benevolent assaults on native people. Assaults facilitated by force of arms, deception, and coercion. Assaults that sought to dismantle native culture with missionary zeal and humanitarian paternalism, and to replace it with something that whites could recognize. These assaults came singly, in partnerships, and from various angles. In general, settlers and missionaries of one flavor or another led the way, taking turns leapfrogging each other into the wilderness. In Canada, it was the French and the Jesuits, followed by the English and the Anglicans, Methodists and Presbyterians. In the American Northeast and along the Atlantic coast, it was the English and the Puritans, Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians, with a smattering of Quakers and other nonconformists working out of Rhode Island. In the Southeast, it was the Spanish and the Jesuits and the Franciscans. In the far west, along the Pacific coast, it was the Spanish and the Franciscans, while much later and farther north in California and up the Pacific coast, it was the Russians and the Orthodox Church. Francis Jennings, in his book The Invasion of America, called Christianity a conquest religion. I suspect this description is true of most religions. I can't think of one that could be termed a seduction religion, where converts are lured in by the beauty of the doctrine and the generosity of the practice. Maybe Buddhism, certainly not Christianity. Missionary work in the New World was war. Christianity, in all its varieties, had always been a stakeholder in the business of assimilation, and, in the 16th century, it was the initial wound in the side of native culture. Or, if you want the positive but somewhat callous view, you might wish to describe Christianity as the gateway drug to supply-side capitalism. George Washington and Henry Knox believed in the potential of Indians to become whites, and they developed a 6-point civilizing plan to accomplish this. Among other things, the plan called for impartial justice towards Indians, for the development of educational experiments to civilize Indian society, and for the prosecution and punishment of anyone who violated native rights. Impartial justice? Prosecute anyone who violated native rights? I'm tempted to say something cranky and sarcastic, but I'm sure Washington and Knox were serious. For his part, Knox argued for native rights and for treating Indian nations as sovereign foreign nations. Knox wrote Washington to say, "How different would be the sensation of a philosophic mind to reflect that instead of exterminating a part of the human race by our modes of population, that we had persevered through all difficulties and at last had imparted our knowledge of cultivation and the arts to the aboriginals of the country." Knox goes on to say that it had been conceived to be impractical to civilize the Indians of North America, but that this opinion is probably more convenient than just. While impartial justice and protection of native rights proved to be empty rhetoric, the desire to find ways to civilize Indians had been an impulse from the beginning of European settlement. And while many of the civilizing programs in Canada and the United States were marked by education of one sort or another, farming for the men, domestic service for the women, along with a little reading, writing, and arithmetic, almost all of them were anchored in Christianity. Teach Indians to fish, but teach them to be Christian fishers, and then you can sell them the fishing gear. The hope for native peoples was that, with a little training and a push in the right direction, they could become contributing members of white North America. This was not to be a compromise between cultures. It was to be a unilateral surrender. Indians were to give up what they had and what they believed in exchange for what whites had and believed. The implication could not have been clearer. European culture, religion, and art were superior to native culture, religion, and art, and the proof of that superiority could be found in the military might of Canada and America. Whenever I think about this, I'm reminded of that television series, Star Trek, and in particular, the Borg, whose battle cry, "Resistance is futile, you will be assimilated," could well have been spoken by John A. MacDonald and Andrew Jackson, or Stephen Harper and George W. Bush. While there are a great many places to start a discussion of assimilation, two excellent beginnings are in 17th century Quebec and 17th century New England. Around 1637, the Jesuit Father Lejeune set about building a Catholic Indian village along the St. Lawrence near Saguenay. He was aided in this effort by Noël Brulard de Sillery, a knight of Malta, and
Backpack here. Level 2.
Let's go this way. Forget that. New kill leader.
Attention,
As our
the champion has been
Here's
eliminated.
your birthday present.